the thing that Danielle Smith, Premier Danielle Smith, is not telling Albertans, or not emphasizing it enough, because she's trying to, I know what she's doing, she's trying to build a Canadian consensus against what she calls the carbon tax, what we all call the tax, really, except for the Supreme Court justices that had a decision favoring the federal government's ability to carbon tax everybody in Canada, but they didn't call it a tax. So what we have here is Premier Danielle Smith, our premier here in Alberta. She's trying to build a Canadian consensus of 7 or so premiers from across the country to stand up and protest the increase in the carbon tax, one of the several increases we're going to have right up till about 2030, 31. And what she fails to mention, what Premier Danielle Smith fails to mention many times, is that Albertans are going to be the ones that are going to be dinged by far the most out of all Canadians from this carbon tax. And that's not according to yours truly, Jay Bortnik. That's not according to the Alberta government. That is according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which reports directly to the Canadian Parliament, not to Justin Trudeau, nor to the 7 Canadian premiers that are against the increase in this carbon tax. They have estimated that the economic and fiscal charges to Albertans would be in the neighborhood of $2,700. Let me take my look at my close paper here. Here it is. I'll put it on the screen here. This year, in the 2024-2025 year, this report was put out last year, by the way, so they already made these estimates. This has been common knowledge, or maybe not so common, for some time, that Albertans would be paying per household $911 more. Or by 2030, the figure will be $2,773 more than they were before all the carbon taxes were put in place a few years ago. So our neighbors right to the east of us are actually significantly less. This year, it's only going to be $525 for people living in Saskatchewan. Well, that's quite a deal. They got 50% off almost. And by 2030, it's $1,723. Oh, but the deals get better as we go east. Whoa, look at this. Manitoba, $1,490 by 2030. This year, it's only $502 more on average. Ontario, slight uptick, $1,820. Nova Scotia, $1,513 by 2030. And PEI, $1,521. And Newfoundland, which has little to complain about in comparison to Albertans, only $1,316 or $377 on average this year. So that's what Danielle Smith, Premier Danielle Smith, is not telling Albertans, is that we're going to get dinged substantially more. Let me think. What does this remind me of? Wait a second. Let me think. Where we're getting dinged substantially more than other Canadians. Equalization. Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Transfer payments. That thing that most Albertans think we're cutting a check for, but we're not. The transfer payments, what the Canadian government transfers our federal taxes, which they collected here in Alberta, and they transfer those taxes and spend them in another province in Canada, or other provinces. And those other provinces are the ones that actually, coincidentally, are not getting dinged as much on this carbon tax as we are. So that's what Premier Danielle Smith here in Alberta is not telling Albertans. So maybe we just don't want to hear it. Maybe we don't want to hear any more anti-Canada rhetoric. If you don't want to hear any more anti-Canada rhetoric, maybe get off this channel right now. I don't know what else I can tell you. You know, we're getting screwed here in Alberta. I just looked up another report. Actually, I did a video on it last year, about a year ago, on equalization and its big brother transfer payments. And, you know, since 1961, Alberta has contributed $611 billion plus. Actually, the estimates are well over that now, since 1961 and $2019, I believe. And so I think this is the bigger story. This carbon tax is nothing in comparison to what they're taking from households in Alberta every year. Like based on Canada's own numbers, the Fraser Institute had calculated that between 2014 and 2018, Albertans had contributed over $94 billion in tax money that was collected here but spent somewhere else, just in that 4 to 5 year period. Now that's the bigger story. You want that per household? Well, per man, woman, and child, well, per person here in Alberta, in its smallest year was $13.4 billion in 2017 that they spent somewhere else. And in 2014, which was an absolutely fantastic year for Alberta, we haven't had a year like that since, they took $27.4 billion from Albertans and spent it somewhere else. I did some math. Let's take the calculator out. Let's see how that compares to these carbon tax numbers. Okay, 27.4 billion divided by, let's call it the last census, even though there were probably less people. This number is going to be a little against us, but let's take the $27.4 billion, put it in the calculator, divide that by 4.3 million people. That's from the 2021 census. And what do we get? We get around $6,300 per person in Alberta. So if you had a household of 3 people, that would be like $18,000 just in a year. Well, that's looking a lot more than that 911 this year, or even in 2030, that $2,773 that we're going to be paying extra here in Alberta on the carbon tax. I did appreciate how Premier Danielle Smith went on about how this carbon tax was not being evenly applied for the first time this year.
We're going to have a federal government asserting that they have to have this power so that everybody is treated equally, and then they don't treat everyone equally. It seems to me that that's something we should go back to the court and ask them whether or not they want to reconsider whether this is an appropriate use of the federal powers. I would rather this have a political solution. I would rather the federal government accept that if this is a painful tax going into winter for Atlantic Canadians, it's a painful tax going into the winter for everyone, and just make sure that he does the right thing and takes the tax off for all types of home heating in every province.
When are we going to address the structural inequalities within Canada that allow this stuff to happen? That allow the Liberal MPs that were elected in Atlantic Canada to hold the balance of power to such an extent that they get an exemption on home heating oil. You know, they get 32 seats in the House of Commons between those 4 provinces. PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland have 32 seats in the House of Commons. And that's out of 338, with a population of barely over 2 million people. And that population isn't growing very fast, folks. Actually, the population that's growing the fastest is actually Alberta. And, you know, we have 34 seats. And guess what our population is? I think I just put it on the calculator. Our population is 4.3 million according to the last census, and actually they're now estimating 4.8 million. And I can guarantee you that all of Atlantic Canada hasn't grown by that much. So why do they still have 32 seats? Why does our premier ignore that fact? If they didn't have the 32 seats, the Liberal government might not have as many seats and therefore might not form government. So yeah, these are inconvenient truths we don't want to talk about. We just want to rail against the carbon tax. We don't want to, a carbon tax that's already been ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. There's nothing we can do about it. Though there is one thing that we can do about it that Danielle Smith seems to be ignoring.